today's session on the winter economic plan that was announced by the Chancellor a week ago, really in lieu of what we were expecting to be a kind of update on the forthcoming budget. We're going to have a very focused session today because we're going to talk about the scheme that has replaced the furlough scheme. We're almost running out of acronyms these days, so I think we'll call it the Job Support Scheme. By way of introduction, my name's Luke Morris and I'm a partner at Scruton Bland. I run our corporate finance business, so I deal with company transactions, valuations, raising finance. And really in the last 6 to 9 months, I've been involved with my esteemed colleague, Sarah Healey Pearce, who's also on the call today, taking responsibility to help our clients navigate through the raft of grants and loans and various other schemes that have come about as a result of the coronavirus pandemic. So we've done a series of these webinars and hopefully you've been able to participate in some of them. They've slowed down a little bit of late, and what we're doing is when something of note comes up, we think it's very easy for us just to take half an hour or so and just have a conversation about it, and that's what we are doing today. Just by way of a little bit of housekeeping, we keep all of the microphones on mute, and that's really just to prevent any background noise. You can use the chat box on the side of your screen. I can see there's something on there already. So do direct any queries or comments through the chat box. Sarah and I will look to deal with those during the course of the presentation, or if it's something more involved, we'll make a note of it and we will follow up afterwards. It's really useful for us if you do ask those questions, because it kind of gives us a sense of what clients, contacts, the business community is thinking about, what sort of questions they have, because I can guarantee you, if you're confused or have a question about something, then you will not be alone. So I do encourage you to ask questions and put comments in the chat box. Let's, without any further ado, let's make a start. And I was thinking that it would be quite good just to, first of all, talk about a bit of context to where we are with this scheme. We understand that the UK cabinet is split. That's largely reported in the press. And broadly speaking, you have the hawks on one side who are eager to lift restrictions and try and get the economy restarted. And this includes Rishi Sunak, our Chancellor, Priti Patel, Gavin Williamson, Liz Truss. But then you have the doves on the other side. It seems that my local MP, Matt Hancock, and Michael Gove, for example, have not yet seen a restriction or a rule that they do not like. So you've got a real split in the cabinet. And as we stand today, the Prime Minister, who's in the middle of this split, if you look at the address that we had last night, it would seem to me that he's very much on the dovish side of that debate. I don't know if you watched what the Prime Minister said or listened to it on the radio, but there was a very veiled threat there that we could well expect another lockdown to be made. And I'll come later to a bit of an economic argument as to why that could be the case. So there's maybe a clue in something he said yesterday. I think it's a bit of a risky game. Government in the country is historically by consent. There are 68 million of us and there are only 650 MPs. And I was really struck by an image from one of the protests last week. And you can see on the screen there, this is a maskless lady in her tweeds and her pearl twin set. Swampy she is not. Nonetheless, she was there at a protest, and this picture of her quite literally being bowled off her feet by the police went viral on the internet and on social media. The reason for putting that there is she doesn't look like the typical protester. And I think we have to ask the question for how much longer people will consent to this kind of law by decree that we are seeing. And indeed, these seemingly arbitrary and rather confusing measures that continue to come out. Anyway, enough of that. On the winter economic plan itself, it was 24th of September last week. What I saw there was really Rishi Sunak's quite hawkish and kind kind of reluctantly, slowly turning the taps off. And there's a quote there. He says, "Our economy is now likely to undergo a more permanent adjustment. The sources of our economic growth and the kinds of jobs we create will adapt and evolve to the new normal, and our plan." I think my paraphrasing of that is, I've changed my mind because some other people in the cabinet want me to change my mind. You can tell that he is a hawk because hitherto, what we were expecting until last week was really taken from his comments that furlough, quote, cannot continue forever. We were all braced for the scheme to come to an abrupt end at the end of this month, at the end of October. But I suppose we're getting a little used to U-turns and governments changing their minds. Only a few weeks ago, we were, of course, being urged to return to our offices, and now we are being urged to stay at home and work from home where we can. Only a few weeks ago, we were being incentivized to get out and eat meals in restaurants and bars. Now those same restaurants and bars are closing by 10 o'clock under the risk of fine or action. So we're kind of getting used to this kind of erratic change from government policy, and I suppose if you think about it, that's no real backdrop for a fiscally responsible budget. So I think that's why we had this winter economic plan announced rather than the budget, which has now been cancelled. So what did he say? Well, my colleague Sarah is going to go into that in a bit more detail, but I suppose I took away from that quote the sense of him preparing the economy for what he calls a permanent adjustment. I'm concerned that all of these measures are pretty much only going to allow businesses to limp on. Sarah will go into more detail, but I think basically what's happened here is that the role of governments and the role of the government and employers has switched around. This job support scheme will see the state contribute to wages if required, but the employer needs to be paying over 50% of the costs itself. So it's far more like this much speculated upon German Kurzarbeit scheme, where the employees need to be working to receive the subsidies. So that's very different from furlough, of course, where a lot of the questions we had when we did sessions like this were really about the fact that, can my employees work when they're on furlough? The answer was no. Here, the employees have to be working in order to obtain some of the subsidies. One of the things the Chancellor didn't do, which we thought that he might do, was to announce industry-specific schemes. So that didn't happen. I think if I was in the business of maybe running a bar or restaurant at the moment, I'd be feeling a little nervous about that, particularly if I was being told that my region was being locked down. If I was running a business linked to aviation, which is down 97%, I think I'd be feeling a bit nervous. No specific support for those sectors. And what we are seeing is actually more stringent requirements to access the cash. So, it's very much Rishi Sunak turning the taps off slowly, but the taps are being turned off. And as he said in the presentation, we are expecting more change to come. I mean, this transitional thing is softening the blow. It's less like a cliff edge. But I think it's inevitable. We've spoken before on some of these webinars. It's highly likely that there are going to be job losses as a result of this. Some others will be gained as the economy rebalances and changes. But I think, by and large, the bulk, on balance, we're going to see more job losses than jobs being gained. Last point, I just wanted to talk very briefly about the costs of these transitional measures, because I always think that's quite interesting. It kind of gives you a sense of how much money the government's spending and how much firepower, if you like, it has remaining. It gives us a clue if there's going to be further measures or further lockdowns. And I was reading a report by Capital Economics, and their assessment puts the cost at roughly £5 billion of this new scheme. I mean, that's no small sum, but it is a fraction of the furlough scheme and what that's cost. I mean, so far, the furlough scheme has cost £40 billion. So, as I say, I think that is maybe indicative of the fact that the government's holding back a little bit on some of its firepower, made possible by the loosening of monetary policy by the Bank of England, and that might become necessary in the future if there are further government restrictions, if they tighten, or if it does become apparent that certain sectors like aviation or restaurants, like I was mentioning before, basically can't stay open. You can see there that there's maybe a bit of room for even more specific industry measures. I wouldn't be surprised if that was something we saw. I think Sarah will talk about this, but we're looking at this sort of 6-month scheme. I think the final comment, this is my final comment, it's becoming more and more difficult to justify this as a kind of a one-off spend, because 6 months from the 1st of November is going to take us into the next fiscal year. So the deficit for the 2021 fiscal year, which is currently standing at something like 320 billion pounds, is not looking like it's going to be a one-off standing in isolation deficit if this is rolling into next year. Who knows? If the virus is not under control by next spring, I feel the government's spent so much political capital on this now, it's very difficult to see how they can go back. Anyway, that's enough from me. I'm now going to hand over to Sarah, who's going to give us a little bit more detail on the workings of the scheme, which I'm sort of seeing as very much a transitional scheme. So, Sarah, over to you.
Thanks very much, Luke. Right, so I have the job of running through the detail of the scheme. And as Luke said, it's the second phase in the government support. So the first phase was the job retention scheme, which changed over the course of the 6 months or so that it was around. And this is the second phase, which is designed, as the Chancellor said, to protect viable jobs, and is aimed at businesses that are facing lower demand for their products and services over the winter months. I'm going to spend the next 10 minutes or so just running through what the scheme is. There are various criteria that employers and employees need to meet, and other factors to consider. Then I'm going to run through a very quick example of how the figures work, because it's much more useful to be able to see how it works when you talk about figures, and then very briefly how to claim it. I think the most important thing to say at this stage is that there is only one official fact sheet that the Revenue have issued about this, and they are talking about more detailed guidance coming out in the next month or so. So there will be lots of questions. I will try and pick up the things that we don't know as we go through, but there are lots of unanswered questions at the moment, I'm afraid. The other important thing to stress is that this new JSS is open to all businesses and employees, even if you haven't utilised the job retention scheme. So you don't have to have made a claim under that to be able to use this new scheme. So what is the scheme? It will run from the 1st of November to the 30th of April. And it's, as Luke said, it's to cover employees that are working. So they have to be working at least a third of their usual working hours. Now, usual working hours is one of the things that we don't know too much about at the moment, although the guidance that exists at present does say that it will be the same definition as under the job retention scheme, which related to the hours that employees were doing before, I think it was 19th of March this year. Actually is, but there's lots of talk of usual working hours. So under this new scheme, the employer will pay for the actual hours that the employee works at full pay, again defined as before the pay that they would have received before March, as we think at the moment. Then of the hours that aren't worked by the employee, the government will effectively give you a grant of a third of those non-working hours. The employer will have to bear the cost of a third, and then effectively the employee bears the cost of a third of the non-working hours as well, because the government have said that they don't expect employers to top up the wages of the employees. There is a cap on the amount that you can claim from the government for the third of the non-working hours, and that's capped at £697.92 a month. I think a couple of things to note. The employees can come on and off the scheme. So as long as they have worked a third of their hours in a pay period, they don't have to do set hours or set days each week. But each time you change their hours, that change has to be in place for 7 days. But you don't have to have them working exactly the same hours every week. The other really important thing is that any changes that you make to working hours or pay, you need to consult with the employee and agree it up front and put it in writing, because it is deemed to be a change to their existing employment contract, and that's really important from an employment law point of view. And keep a copy of the agreement that you sign and send to them, because the revenue are saying that they may well ask to see that agreement. So basically, the employer is paying the employee and can claim a certain amount of that back. You're only able to claim back a third of the gross salary. You're not able to claim back any national insurance, employers' national insurance or pension contributions, unlike the beginning of the job retention scheme. So what are the things that employers need to think about? So I've already just mentioned that you're not able to claim back the employer's national insurance or pension contributions. It's only the gross salary or wages that you're paying. The claims portal, the claim will be made through a portal in exactly the same way as the job retention scheme, and that portal will come live from December 2020. So although the scheme starts in November, the first claim, you won't be able to make that until December 2020, and the claims will need to be made in arrears. So you are only able to make a claim for a period once you have paid your employee and also done your RTI submission for the month, and you will then be able to go onto the portal and make the claim. So that does have cash flow implications for businesses, which is really important to remember. The job retention scheme, you were able to do the claims before you actually made paid the employees, but on this one, the employer will have to make the payment before they can claim the money back. It will run in conjunction with the job retention bonus, which is the scheme that the Revenue brought out a couple of months ago, where employees that payroll on the 31st of January 2021, the business will receive £1,000 for every employee that's still employed. And so you are able to claim that and utilise the JSS as well, which is helpful. And every business making a claim has to have a UK bank account and a UK PAYE scheme. There are a couple of departures from the job retention scheme, which I thought was very interesting. They apply to large companies only. So small and medium-sized companies don't have to meet these two criteria. And we don't know what a large company is at the moment. We think, judging by the guidance that's been released, it will be employers with over 250 employees, but we don't know at the moment. That needs to be confirmed. And the guidance that's out at the moment says that these large employers, or large companies, sorry, they will have to meet a financial assessment test, which means that they have to be able to prove that their turnover has reduced as a result of COVID. And it's interesting that it's based on turnover and not profits, but they will also I think the guidance says that dividend payments and any other capital payments to shareholders will not be expected to be made. So the government are starting to tighten up on those two areas for large companies. So from an employee's point of view, you will be able to claim for employees that were included on the payroll before the 23rd of September. So that's, I'm assuming at this point, that means they're on the payroll and have been included in an RTI submission. But again, we need to just wait to confirm that the revenue do mean that they have to have been included in the RTI as well. The employee must be, to be able to claim under the scheme, the employee must work at least 33% of their hours. They can work more, but it has to be at least 33%. And that 33% has to be paid at their normal contracted pay with any changes agreed in writing, which we've covered. And that 33% is definitely around for the first 3 months of the job support scheme. And the guidance says that the government may change that after the first 3 months. So if you do have employees under this new scheme, you must keep an eye on whether the government changed that 33% after the 1st of February next year, because they have said they might well do that. The other important thing to think about is any employees that are have been made redundant or have been issued a notice of redundancy, you can't claim for them under the scheme while they're still with you. Okay, so let's have a quick look at an illustration. So if you have an employee that works 5 days a week and earns their usual working hours of 5 days a week, and they earn £400 a week for that, you have a discussion with them and you decide to reduce their working hours to 2 days a week for the next 6 months. So that's 40% of their usual working hours. So that meets that criteria. Under the scheme, the employee will receive £320, and that is made up of £160 for their working hours, which is 40% of their normal £400. They would then receive £80 from you as the employer, which is a third of the remaining 60%, their non-working hours. You as the employer would then also pay them a further £80, which is another third of their non-working hours. But you would be able to claim that second third back from the government. So effectively the government is paying that second third. So the employee receives £320 gross wages. We're assuming that would be subject to tax and national insurance. You as an employer have paid them £320, but will be able to claim back £80. So the net cost to you of the gross wages will be £240. You then will pay the national insurance, the employer's national insurance and the pension on top of that, and be unable to claim any of that back from the government. So it's quite a complicated calculation, and I think you're going to have to think about it carefully when you're running payroll and considering working hours for employees. Unfortunately, there isn't anything in the guidance at the moment about how holiday pay will interact with the scheme or about sick pay. Unfortunately, we don't know what the government will do about sick pay or employees that are having to shield or self-isolate. So the government have said that they'll release further guidance on that. And we don't know anything about employees returning from maternity leave and things like that. So there are an awful lot of questions, I'm afraid, at the moment. So how will you claim it? I've already said it will be claimed through a portal in exactly the same way as the job retention scheme, and that portal will open from December. But the important thing is to remember that you're claiming in arrears rather than upfront, like a lot of the job retention claims. we don't know yet what information you'll have to put onto the portal for a claim. I would expect it to be very similar to the information that's been entered for the job retention scheme. The only additional item is there may be some sort of contact details for your employees, because the revenue in their fact sheet that's come out, they have said they intend to inform the employees directly of the full details of claims made. So that suggests you may have to enter an email address or a telephone number or something for an employee, but we don't know that yet. So it's just something to bear in mind. So that's kind of all we know at the moment. It's a very brief run through. As I said, there's not a huge amount of information available at the moment, but I think it's crucial to start thinking now about whether you intend to utilise this scheme. I think it will work nicely for some businesses. It may not be appropriate for all businesses because of the cash flow implications, and also the fact that you are actually, as a business, you will be bearing the cost of non-working hours in a similar way to the end of the job retention scheme. So it may not necessarily work for you, but it's definitely worth having a think about and planning what you will do from the 1st of November. And please feel free to give either myself or Luke or one of our colleagues a call if you wanted to chat through whether it's appropriate for you or what the costs might be for you as an employer. I hope Luke's been keeping an eye on the chat box, because I've not been reading it. I hope I've answered everyone's questions. If you have any other questions, then please feel free to enter them in the chat, or we will certainly, as a firm, we will be keeping an eye on the guidance that's coming out, and whether we run another webinar when the detailed guidance comes out, we'll have to see what it says, but we will certainly be updating our website and our social media feeds. So please, I've put the details on the screen, please keep an eye on that, or contact any of us if you would like to chat it through further. I didn't have anything else that I wanted to talk about particularly. Luke, I don't know whether you wanted to mention anything.
No, thanks, Sarah. I think it's just, isn't it, looking at the final piece of that guidance, which talks about HMRC checks, and I guess there's been quite a bit in the news, hasn't there, around the sort of the fraudulent claims and the issues with fraud around the job retention scheme. I think that last point about informing employees directly is quite interesting, isn't it, from
definitely
HMRC. Yeah, there's a question there about have the conversations or inform about short-term working arrangements. And as I think you made the point, Sarah, it's a kind of change to employment contract by agreement. So it's about keeping that record in writing as well, because again, in the HMRC checks bit of the guidance, it says that agreement needs to be made available to HMRC on request, doesn't it?
Yeah,